remarkable 19th century journey of two Civil War doctors, abolitionists, suffragists, educators, and believers in a free society. Our collaboration helped change America before, during, and after the Civil War period.
Now, as promised, a little bio. Do you want a beautiful winter home in Florida, located on the highest, driest, healthiest spot for a town? The year was 1871, and the town of Hawks Park was established, later to become modern-day Edgewater in 1925. But by that time, many of the residents had forgotten my contributions and the tremendous amount of work that had transpired in the years before. Let me take you back. Back before the war between the states, a time of peace and prosperity in a growing country. Back to my beloved Florida. Back to our honeymoon in 1854. I was 28, my Esther, my Etta, was a mere 19. We were both born in New Hampshire, and I followed my passion for education, becoming director of a school at 16 and teaching in New York and Savannah, Georgia. My mental attainments and capacity to learn led me to forge ahead and earn an MD in Cincinnati, Ohio. I met my blushing bride, who also yearned to become a physician, and whose grandfather had fought bravely in the Revolution and the War of 1812. Very attractive. Bright hazel eyes, 5'7", taller than most women of the day, and full of ambition. We were married and we vacationed in Manatee, Florida. And while there, Etta taught a small school of poor, white, and some colored or Negro children, which at the time was illegal in the South. She was threatened with imprisonment for doing that in 1854 in Florida. Perhaps the first integrated school in the United States. We fell in love with Florida, the place of natural beauty on the edge of the continent, where dreamers sought paradise and still find it. Returning to the north, we realized the country was experiencing growing pains of the highest magnitude. Slavery was the very thread connecting the oncoming Civil War. The decision of the masses to expand the evil practice of human bondage into the new states of the Western Territories became a catalyst to violence all over the land. The Dred Scott decision of 1854, bloody Kansas in 1856, and John Brown's body smoldering in the grave in 1859. I became an abolitionist speaker, and along with William Lloyd Garrison, James Redpath, and my friend Frederick Douglass, we made our voices heard. Meanwhile, Esther received her medical degree from the New England College for Women, becoming one of the first female physicians in the United States. The war finally broke out in Charleston, South Carolina on April 12th, 1861, when Confederate artillery bombarded Fort Sumter. 33 hours of shelling. The United States became disunited, and America was about to become a bloodbath. Americans killing Americans in America. 700,000 would give the ultimate sacrifice in the next 4 years. At the outbreak of the war, Etta and I volunteered with the Freedom Society, and we were sent to Hilton Head Island in South Carolina. And I became the surgeon for the 1st Colored Regiment of South Carolina, which was the first black regiment in the Civil War. The war raged on from the first shots at Sumter to bloody Antietam, September 17, 1862, where 26,000 died in Maryland that day. Gettysburg followed in July of 63. In 3 days in that small town of Pennsylvania, 51,000 fell. During that battle, rebel commander Robert E. Lee tried in vain to bring the war to northern soil. But General Meade, the Yankee general, fails to follow the Confederate forces and finish them off, and President Lincoln was furious. The war raged on, and I was one of the first to petition President Lincoln to arm the new black troops. It was indeed my letter, the first time ever, to suggest that the freed blacks in the North were to be given weapons. Who would make a better soldier against these rebels of the South? Eventually, not until late in 1863, President Lincoln succumbed, and he allowed that to happen. And eventually 200,000 African-American black soldiers fought in the Civil War. Etta followed to South Carolina after being turned down as an Army nurse by Dorothea Dix for being too young and attractive. Dorothea Dix, the director of nursing during the Civil War, interviewed Etta in Washington, D.C. and said she was way too attractive, not plain looking enough. She didn't get that job, but she followed me to South Carolina. Back then, the notion of a capable woman doctor was quite uncommon, as women were not even allowed to view a man's body. Joining me in Hilton Head, we established the first hospital for colored soldiers. It's called General Hospital Number 10. And Etta assisted in the daily doctoral and nursing duties while starting a school for poor families of the troops. From the back porch of General Hospital Number 10 in Hilton Head, she reviewed soldiers and functioned as a triage, still being discriminated against for her gender. So great was the desire of former slaves to learn to read that the Army made teachers available as one of the benefits of enlistment. By 1864, the tides of war favored our esteemed republic, and the Union had captured every Confederate capital in the South, except Florida. On February the 20th, 1864, at the Battle of Olustee, the largest battle in the Civil War in the state of Florida, the Battle of Ocean Pond, it's up near Lake City, 10,000 troops engaged in the soft pine scrub along with northern Florida's railroad route from Jacksonville to Tallahassee. General Truman Seymour, the Yankee commander, disobeyed orders and he went west along the railroad lines toward the Florida capital in Tallahassee. Trying to become a hero, taking the last Reb capital, Seymour tried, but the brutal fighting recalled by the troops involved to be as gruesome as Gettysburg at Olustee. As gruesome as Gettysburg, that brutal fighting. The Confederates defended their home ground at Olustee. 2,800 perished in the fight. General Truman called it a devilish hard rub. The Union outlasted the rebel armies eventually in the Civil War, leading to the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses Grant at the battle at the Appomattox Courthouse on April the 9th, 1865. 5 nights later, our beloved president was murdered on Good Friday in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. 5 nights after the surrender. 700,000 had died in 4 years. But finally the troops would return home. To Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. We'll get back to that. By August, I requested a furlough from my commanding officer to travel to Florida, August 1865, to purchase 2 tracts of land, which would become Port Orange, at a cost of $1 an acre. I purchased 500 acres. Originally, I named it Orange Port, but another town had already taken that name. That was discovered through the post office. I created the Florida Land and Lumber Company that same year, 1865. I sold shares for $1,000 to Union officers and $100 to former black soldiers, fully expecting a return on my investment through hard work and the blessings of our Heavenly Father. 500 freed men, former soldiers and families, arrived to Port Orange from South Carolina. The land was on the north side of Spruce Creek and Dunlawton. A sawmill by Pod's Inlet was built. 1,000 more settlers arrived to start a new life on the shores of Volusia County. My darling Etta started the school there, teaching the children around a huge fire, instructing while shielding her eyes from the smoke and the flames. 15 black children, 8 whites, and 2 mulattoes at her school in Ponce Inlet. The first integrated school in Florida officially in November of 1866. They played harmoniously as kittens, she would recall. By 1869, with tensions and bitter complaints from white parents, her school was torched. Hardships ensued from the beginning, and my plan in paradise quickly became fraught with more challenges than we could possibly endure. The steamship carrying the sawmill machinery sunk in a turbulent storm to the bottom of Ponce Inlet. The company treasurer of the Florida Land and Lumber Company embezzled the funds meant for the freedmen and their families. Etta reached her breaking point after the school was burned down, and she decided to move back to Lynn, Massachusetts, to start a private medical practice. Our marriage became a snowbird affair after that point. With Esther gone most of the year, I took a variety of positions in the growing Florida country. So after the war, I was director of customs in Pensacola, publisher and writer of the Florida Gazetteer. I documented every business that was in Florida at the time. I compiled a stupendous amount of statistics. I became the first superintendent of Volusia County schools. And I helped to write the state's constitution. About that time, I met another Florida land speculator named Matthias Day. He came from Ohio, and he surveyed the land that he had purchased at the old Samuel Williams plantation north of Dunlawton. Day paid $1,200 for 3,200 acres. And the town eventually took the name Daytona in 1871. The land that I had purchased 3 miles south of New Smyrna became my next endeavor. With my dear Etta up north, I built a house along the Indian River in 1874, which still stands on Riverside Drive today. The settlement was named Hawks Park, and I donated funds for a city hall and a library, soliciting settlers to come to my beloved Florida. Do you want a beautiful winter home located on the highest, driest, and healthiest spot for a town? That little settlement later changed its name to Edgewater. My beloved Etta passed on to heaven in 1906, and I continued practicing medicine until my passing in 1910. 52 years we lived and loved, and we cared for humanity. In 1892, I spoke at the Ormond Horticulture Society. 1892, reciting this prayer as a motto for our lives together. Almighty designer, builder, and sustainer of all life, we can only honor you by improving ourselves. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a brief biography of our lives together. Would you like to see some imagery to go with that? Miss Etta, could you go to the next slide? So, we grew up in New Hampshire. I was from a little town in the southern part of New Hampshire, and together we made that our home and grew up in that whole area, and right near Vermont in New England. Like I said, my sister introduced me to young Etta. She came into my drugstore pharmacy that I was running in New Hampshire. 1854. I had courted some ladies, but when I had first spoken to Etta, she enamored me to the point where I finally proposed to her after I had done a stint down in Savannah, Georgia with a school and went all the way back up to New Hampshire and proposed. We therefore decided to go to Florida on our honeymoon, and we went to a place called Manatee. This is near Tampa on the west coast. We traveled to New York, came by steamboat all the way around the tip to come to Manatee. And this is where we stayed which she did. We stayed for quite a while. I had sold everything I owned to go on the honeymoon, so money was always a little tight. So finding a job teaching at that first school where she integrated was going to be at Manatee as well. Next slide. This is the first school in Manatee, Florida. And you notice, these are enslaved children. Enslaved children, of course, were given perhaps one set of clothes per year, perhaps at Christmas. Some of them were literally given as gifts to other white children on plantations. The first school in Manatee at Edgewater. Next slide. Along the way, abolitionism started to just curdle my bones. I felt the need to speak out against this unspeakable violation of human rights, slavery as we knew it. This is a good friend named James Redpath. Mr. Redpath was a writer, an abolitionist, a friend of John Brown, and later he decided that Haiti was a place we could relocate slaves to. So they literally started to bring slaves over to the island of Haiti. I went there several times. I believed this was a good idea. Even our great President Lincoln, by the way, believed in what we then called the American Colonization Society. One way we could help the enslaved was perhaps repatriate them back either to Africa. There's a country called Liberia there with its capital Monrovia, named after James Monroe, our 5th president, or to Haiti. And several boats and hundreds of blacks were brought to those places. I went there, I believed in that in Denver for a short time, and this is my good friend James Redpath, who was the director of that. His association with, next slide, the great John Brown is legendary. John Brown, as you know, the fiery abolitionist. If this man came into the room right now, he would speak of the Bible, he would be throwing verses at you, and he would tell you how evil the institution of slavery is, of course. John Brown took up the sword against slavery, attacking our arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, October 1859. Captured by a United States commander named Robert E. Lee, along with his subordinate officer named Jed Stewart, who were still in the United States Army then. John Brown was wounded there, so his son died at Harpers Ferry at the arsenal. This, of course, is the famous picture of Brown after they had arrested him, and they were bringing him to his hanging that day. And as he came down the steps of Harpers Ferry, he looked upon this young woman and her little black baby. And he bent down and he kissed that baby. They walked him to the scaffolding. In the crowd was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth. In the crowd was a young commander named Stonewall Jackson. John Brown hung that day. James Redpath and I were friends with John Brown. My friend Frederick Douglass listened to Brown's story and Brown's plan and said, "I'm not going to be a part of your violence, Captain Brown." This is John Brown, of course, he's part of that story. John Brown went to the grave that day, but his sentiment, of course, stayed with our Union soldiers. And the abolition of slavery, of course, was going to be on the horizon. But there's going to be a lot of bloodshed before that happened. William Lloyd Garrison, perhaps the most famous abolitionist of the United States in history. Garrison started a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831. And The Liberator was the vehicle by which most of America got to learn about the horrors of slavery in America. William Lloyd Garrison. Next slide. This is the first issue of The Liberator, 1831. Garrison wrote me many letters. We corresponded. He hired me to speak. I shared a stage with Garrison in Massachusetts, followed by a young upcoming escaped slave named Frederick Douglass, who eventually had to leave the United States because of the death threats against him. Douglass had moved to London by the time. This is early on in the beginning of the Liberator. And the Liberator, of course, would go on for many years. 30 years before the Civil War would even start from the first issue. William Lloyd Garrison's famous Liberator. Our friend Frederick Douglass, around the Civil War period. Orator extraordinaire. There wasn't a man more popular on the stage speaking out against abolition than Frederick Douglass. Douglass had two sons who fought in the Civil War. One fought at Olustee here in Florida and was wounded. Douglass, again, incredible life. Escaped slavery in Maryland. His speeches are, bar none, perhaps the most eloquent ever, and like I said, chased out of America, fearing for his life, to London, and then returns, visits Lincoln twice in the White House, begging Lincoln, let the black man fight in the war. He did not have a good relationship with Lincoln. Lincoln dragged his feet on this entire issue, by the way, of course. In the beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln, our great emancipator eventually, Abraham Lincoln was not about emancipating any slaves in the beginning of this war. Abraham Lincoln was about preserving the Union of the United States. That was the number one priority, not releasing any slaves. It took Douglass. It took abolitionist speakers. It took a whole country united for Lincoln to change his mind and finally enable black soldiers to actually join in the ranks. And by that time, the Union was losing the war. We're talking early 1863. Frederick Douglass and Lincoln adversarial relationship, but eventually our great president sees the light, turns the Civil War into the preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery. It's quite an interesting relationship that they had. I myself wrote a letter in 1861, and I regret these words, but I later changed them around. I said the biggest favor anyone could do in 1861, since Lincoln was not letting blacks fight in the war, remember, I was one of the first ones to suggest blacks getting weapons, which was not happening in 1861. And I did say in the letter that one of the greatest favors someone could do is assassinate President Lincoln and get him out of the way. He's the one thing that stood in the way of blacks getting a weapon in the Civil War, and eventually he changed his mind on that. I do hail President Lincoln for changing his mind on that. I will verify that, yes, he is the great emancipator, eventually. But early on in the war, this was certainly not the case. The great Frederick Douglass. Next slide. We mentioned the fact about Esther coming down into Hilton Island, where I had been stationed at during the war. And this is a cartoon about that. We steamed up the harbor to Hilton Head, and just as the sun was sinking, we all joined, and he sang this hymn of thanksgiving, and the name of the boat that she was on was called the USS Delaware. And there were several northern abolitionists and teachers and doctors on the boat when they arrived. There was this experiment going on there. There was an experiment going on in Port Royal, South Carolina, where the slaves had been released from the plantations because the plantation owners had evacuated, because the Yankees had bombarded the cities there. And so now there were these freed blacks, they needed education, they needed food, and this entire boat of people from the north came down to help. This is the Sea Islands where this activity was beginning to happen at that moment. You can see here, of course, Hilton Head. You can see Modesto Island, St. Helena Island, where eventually I'm going to have a house there. And up in the upper right, all the way up there, is where Charleston is, where the war had started. The Sea Islands became this place where this experiment was happening already with freed blacks. There was a colonel named Hunter in the Union Army who actually got together a regiment of freed blacks. Abraham Lincoln found out about it, made him disband that regiment. Next slide. There's a legendary story about the monarch oak on the island where I started to educate, my wife started to educate the Negro children. And so there is a real oak tree called the monarch oak. There's also the angel oak up in that area, and still there today. This is a little story about how she would teach children underneath the oak tree on lots of days. Next slide. And there it is. The angel oak tree, very close to here, this one is the largest oak east of the Mississippi River. We have some pretty big oak trees around here too, by the way. Get to see one of those shortly. Some of the letters that were written between us during our lives. And this particular letter is a letter from Eda's brother, who was on the ship, the Wabash, Hilton Head, South Carolina, February 17th, 1862, Monday afternoon. Dear Sister Eda, Eda's brother, Union Army sailor on board the Wabash, under the direction of Commodore DuPont. They took Fort Clark from the Rebs along in the Sea Islands here, and this is a letter that he wrote to his sister that is now on file among several in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. She corresponded with her little brother all the time. She had two brothers that actually fought in the war. Next one. That's the Wabash. That's the boat he was on. It had 3 12-pound cannons. It's a steamboat, converted. USS Wabash. Next slide. Another letter from her brother. And this one again, Hilton Head. This one is before that last one, November 12th, 1861. Now think about this, ladies and gentlemen. That's the letterhead, literally it's on. Dear Sister. The war started in April, and already Yankees had gunboats off the coast of South Carolina. And this is a letter he's writing to his sister about that. You could, possibly, read his cursive here. But it's remarkable. He talks about a battle. The battle lasted about an hour, about 4 miles from the place of the ship, and I didn't care about being any nearer, he says. I love the stationery they were using, right? This is my Eda's brother writing from the boat, the USS Wabash, in 1861. Next slide. A letter that I sent to my dear wife. New York. This is in 1862. Dear wife, it has just occurred to me that you might be away at Bradford. Well, I am waiting, for it's been a week. Oh, fine, I'm sitting in Todd's office. Shall start soon an hour for Beecher's Church in Brooklyn. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was the most famous man in America when he wrote this. When I wrote this letter, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. Church in Brooklyn, hundreds of people would flock to that church in Brooklyn. Still there. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher had a sister, you might have heard of. She wrote a little book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Visited the Hotel Ormond in the 1890s. Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher had a brother who was a best friend of ours. He was a colonel in the Army in South Carolina. The Beecher preacher family had a father named Lyman who was a preacher. Legendary family, the Beecher. But my reference to, I'm about to go to Beecher's Church in Brooklyn here. Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous man in America, literally at the time. When the Civil War was over, who did Lincoln ask to go down to Fort Sumter to reclaim the fort and raise the American flag and give the keynote address? Reverend Henry Ward Beecher did. But by 1875, Beecher was in a little hot water. Still an adultery trial. The great Reverend was accused of infidelity. The story of Henry Ward Beecher, of course, is legendary as well. but the fact that I'm on the way to go to his church here, and I reference that because Etta would have been interested in that. Everybody was interested in what Beecher had to say. Beecher was one of the leading abolitionists of the day as well. Beecher would literally pay for slaves to be freed, and then he would bring them into his church, and he would have people adopt them, and people would make a donation to adopt a newly freed slave. Sounds interesting. Like auctioning off by sort of charity at your church. These people who had just been freed, and he had paid for their release. Henry Ward Beecher's quite a story. I go on to describe that I'm looking for a job up north. This is before I came down to South Carolina High by the Freedmen's Bureau. I also talk about here, I have some fruit, some dried fruit, and some peaches and apples. My boxes and trunks make for a formidable pile. So as part of our correspondence together today that's at the Library of Congress. Next. Some of the black troops in South Carolina at the time. The black troops finally, after Lincoln had let them enlist, a typical white Union soldier was paid $14 a month. $7 a month. Half is what a black soldier was paid. Of course, Douglas petitioned and continued to petition to raise the wage of the black soldiers right up until about a month before the war, and it finally happened, but they never got paid the same as a white soldier. Even though in the fight, next slide, in the fight, Olustee, Florida, February 20th, 1864. In the fight, black soldiers, if you notice, black soldier here. In the fight, when people talk about the bravery of African American soldiers, they said there wasn't a more ferocious soldier than the black man with a gun against the Rebs. At Olustee, it was horrific. The Union lost the battle. The Rebs defended the western route to Tallahassee, and Florida never lost its capital during the Civil War. The governor of Florida, Milton, killed himself. Killed himself when the war was over. The governor of this state killed himself, committed suicide, because he couldn't live in a land where, of course, those slaves were free. At the end of the Battle of Olustee, there was such bloodshed, several black troops, of course, fought in Olustee, including, again, one of Frederick Douglass' sons. There were wounded black troops on the battlefield. The Union was retreating back to Jacksonville. There's a railroad route that goes from Jacksonville to Lake City, okay, all the way to Tallahassee. So they're marching, retreating back to Jacksonville. 2,800 had died, many wounded on the battlefield up at Olustee, and some of them were black soldiers. Some of the Reb soldiers literally, per the direction of President Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, the order was you did not take Negroes prisoner. You were to execute them where they lay on the battlefield. That happened at Olustee. Possibly hundreds of black soldiers were literally killed who were wounded on the battlefield at Olustee, right here in Florida, on the battle on February 20th, 1864. Truman Seymour, the commander, again referred to it as a devilish hard rub. He had made a giant mistake. He actually went past the orders of his commanding officer, who was actually in Charleston, a Union commander named Gilmore, and Seymour thought, I'm going to be the one to take Tallahassee. Let's go. Let's march from Jacksonville. Bad move, Seymour. A very controversial commander who had many, many men killed unnecessarily here at Olustee. Next slide. Another shot here. Former slaves, including the little boy, now trained in an artillery unit, firing one of those giant 12-pound cannons. Look into that little boy's eyes and wonder what he's thinking at that moment. Next slide. This is a stereoscope slide of one of the schools that Esther started in South Carolina. Stereoscopes were part of the entertainment of the day. Little slide projectors. You bought these slides, you put them inside of them. Look and see three-dimensional images that you've never seen before. And during the Civil War, this was the most popular thing in many households. So this is one of the schools that Etta had started. There was adults in the school too, including soldiers. Next slide. Some more cartoons for you. Merely a subterfuge, which means sort of a disguise. It talks about the fact that they wish to impress you. She's talking about these newly freed blacks. With the idea that even as slaves, that they would not work so hard as now. And will occasionally speak of the money given them for holidays by old massa. But this is merely a subterfuge with them, and you will find it hard to find an adult among them so degraded as to be really willing to return to their old lives. So she had this thought about working with these newly freed blacks. That some of them were just sort of making believe like what they had to do, work real hard now, being freed. But she realized that was really just a disguise, because really none of them really thought that way, ultimately. Again, these people had been robbed of their freedom right up until this point. Next one. The Freedmen's Bureau was an idea of President Lincoln on how we're going to help those 4 million newly freed slaves in the South. And the idea was this is going to be a government agency that's going to provide food rations, education, training for jobs to the slaves, formerly enslaved. So this explains the purpose for the Freedmen's Bureau, which I and my wife worked for. Our goals were to help and serve you, and as a bureaucracy, we want to help and adjust you to free life. We can help provide you with food, shelter, medication, and employment. We can also provide education and help you buy land. So this is explaining what was to try to be done with these newly freed people. Initially, right after the Civil War, many of these people literally just started to roam the South looking for their family members. Their brothers, sisters, sons, uncles that had been sold to other plantations. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency that hired hundreds of people to come down and try to help. I mean, they needed everything from food, training, education, medicine. Next slide. I mean, eventually we're going to give, with the 15th Amendment, we got 3 amendments after the Civil War, 13, 14, 15. 13 abolishes slavery, 14 gives citizenship, and the 15th Amendment is going to give those black men now the right to vote. They're online to get the right to vote. A hateful organization starts right about this time in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Their entire reason for starting was to prevent these black men from voting. And that organization was started by former Confederates, and it's called the Ku Klux Klan. Entirely put together to stop the black men from voting. The period of lynching begins. It doesn't stop until the 1940s. So this is Esther's contract when she was hired by the Freedmen's Bureau. November 27, 1864, certified Esther Hawks, a native of New Hampshire, residence in New Hampshire, age 28, hazel eyes, 5'7", complexion light, hair. Personally appeared before me and took and subscribed to Social Allegiance. So that's the original document where she signed on. And she also looked for a job for a while. Like we said, Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of nursing, turned her down up north. And finally I said, Esther, you need to come down to South Carolina. We can do this together. We can open up this hospital. We can educate these people. It's her contract. Next slide. So one of our other endeavors, and one of the ways I made some money before the war, after the war, was with a special concoction. It was a stimulant of sorts. It's an original bottle. Doctor Hawks Universal Stimulant. So in my pharmacy, we mixed up rum, alcohol bitters, loblolly seeds. Shook it up, drained the dredge off the top a couple times, bottled it up. I sold this stuff to soldiers on boats. I sold this stuff to sailors on boats, soldiers out in the field. That's an original bottle from one of Dr. Hawks' stimulants. Elixir, relaxation drink. This is one of the ways we decided that we would make a little money on the side. And that's an original bottle there.
I had no part in that.
No, of course. According to an early advertisement, it was specified to cure headaches and toothaches. Why don't you read that, my love? Read that part for us.
I can't see without my glasses.
Okay. According to an early advertisement, it was specified to cure headaches and toothaches, as well as other ills. The term universal suggests a cure-all, and indeed it was claimed that it aids in, quote, circulation of blood, stimulates various organs and tissues to a lively and healthful action, relieves all pain and soreness in any part of the body, and imparts new life and vigor to the whole system. In other words, the product claims to be a restorative, a stimulant, a painkiller, and an invigorator. Imparter of vitality in a single bottle. It sounds likely to have contained a goodly percentage of alcohol, and no doubt along with a variety of botanicals. Of course, rum was a byproduct of all those sugar plantations, and of course imbibed by many. But that was Dr. Hawks' universal stimulant. Next slide. Camped down to Florida after the war, and I mentioned before, this is where we're going to start school, and the story of a little place today called Port Orange, but then called Freemanville. So this is a special historic marker, and we'll read that for you. Founded soon after the U.S. Civil War, the settlement that would become Freemanville was established by Dr. John Milton Hawks, an abolitionist and Union Army surgeon, along with other Union Army officers and the Florida Land and Lumber Company. In 1866, roughly 500 former slaves, we talked about this earlier, many of whom had fought for the Union during the war, and their families initially settled here. Additional 1,000 came with Arabia steamboats. And of the 3,000 blacks that made Florida their home, roughly half settled near the Halifax River, thus making the area the most populous in Volusia County at the time. In 1867, which today Port Orange boasts as its origin, 1867. In 1867, Dr. Hawks named the settlement Port Orange. Due to the harsh farming conditions and poor supplies, the settlement disbanded. In 1869, many of the settlers returned to their home states or headed for area citrus groves looking for work. However, a few of those original freed slaves stayed. Over time, the settlement became known as Freemanville. Today, the Mount Moriah Baptist Church is the last remaining structure from this pioneering African-American community in Port Orange. Try it out for US 1, Mount Moriah Baptist Church. 1912 is actually the date on it. It's leaning over a little bit to from the northeast wind over the last 100 and several years. Still has an active church community, Mount Moriah Baptist Church. Next slide. Port Orange Bridge. John Lawton Bridge. Early 1900s. Interesting. Yeah.
So how does they handle navigation?
Navigation of boats?
Yeah, how could it go?
Oh, there was a drawbridge there. You could open it up. Yeah. Now, eventually, this becomes Dunn Lawton, by the way. Dunn was Sarah Dunn, who owned the plantation where today is Sugar Mill Gardens, Dunn Lawton Plantation. And she had a lawyer named Lawton. Dunn, owner, Lawton, together. It's two different people. Next slide. At that plantation I just referred to, the Dunn Lawton Plantation, which was one of the largest, other than Below Plantation, up in Ormond, here in Florida. There were 18 plantations right along the coast here, some of them right here in your very town. This is the famous Confederate oak tree that would have been there when we were there back in the 1860s. Confederate oak tree on the Dunlawton plantation. Next slide. My friend Matthias Day, I met him at a hotel in Jacksonville. He wanted to buy some land, invest some money in Florida, buy some land. And so I said, why don't you come with me on a boat? We'll go take the river down. And we went down the Halifax River, and that's when he bought the property, which is today Daytona Beach. It's Matthias Day. Matthias Day, by the way, eventually left, and nobody in his family stayed. He had a son named Loomis, street's named after him right there, off of Ridgewood. But he left. The town eventually decided to keep his name, and they incorporated in 1876 in a little house that's right on Beach Street today, called the Abbey. Same house. They incorporated the town of Daytona. But he left. He went back up to Mansfield, Ohio. Excellent. Beach Street, Daytona, before the advent of horseless carriages, automobiles. So in 1941, I had passed in 1910, but in 1941 this appeared in the Observer, and it was a ode to some of the things that my wife and I had done here in Florida. And it was written by a captain named Charles Coe, whose ancestors are still alive today. And he does a program about his ancestor, Captain Coe. So it says here, a record of Volusia County's historical facts would be far from complete if it fails to include the life works of the late Dr. John Milton Hawks, founder of Hawks Park, 2 miles south of New Smyrna. This modest and genial man, to know whom was to like and respect, deserves more than passing notice in these strenuous times. Again, think about it. This was written in 1941. Pearl Harbor just happened. Lovable traits, mental attainments that marked him in any community in which he lived. Talks about my early birth here in Bradford, New Hampshire, 1826, and death in Hawks Park, April 1910. Indicating unusual mental capacity at an early age, he took charge of a district school in his home at the age of 16. Talked about this a little later, and then I taught in New York and Georgia, and then it goes on to talk a little bit more about the story of the settlement of Port Orange. This appeared in the local newspaper right at the advent of World War II, about my life. Excellent. So in a spot not very far from here is where we are both, I'm laid to rest. My wife is actually up in Lynn, Massachusetts. She died there, but this is my grave over in Edgewater Cemetery. Notice there's a couple of different stones here. This one says Major John Milton Hawks, a surgeon in the U.S. Army. On the newer stone, Hawks Park town founder, and now the city of Edgewater. And this is a monument to Esther and our lives together. And her favorite motto, in the proper training of the children rests the hope of the world. Esther had written that and lived that. Next slide. Okay. So as we're wrapping some things up here for this presentation, this is what we began. My wife wrote a diary the entire time, which you can find. I have a copy, of course, of that diary. And it goes over, in detail many of the things she witnessed on a daily basis. It's quite astonishing to read through that diary that was published in the 1980s. And one of the last portraits done of myself. Next slide. 2 quotes to summarize our lives. As I mentioned when I spoke at the Ormond Horticultural Society, I would say that prayer. Almighty designer, builder, and sustainer of all life, we can only honor you by improving ourselves. We live that. And Esther's famous quote, she dedicated her life to. In the proper training of the children rests the hope of the world. As an educator, you can as a parent, as a student, should just reverberate how important it is to educate our children.
Please
Okay.
join me in thanking Joe and
Yes.